Hi, show friends. Welcome to another episode of Bible Q&A. Today we're discussing, why was Jesus always courting controversy? Jesus is honored throughout the world, but in Judea 2,000 years ago, this wasn't the case at all. He lost many of his disciples in John chapter 6 verses 60 to 66. He was nearly thrown off a cliff in Luke chapter 4 verses 28 to 30. He was scorned in Galilee, the place of his birth, according to Mark chapter 6 verses 1 to 6. With all of the miracles he performed and the prophecies he fulfilled, why did Jesus' teachings divide the nation like this? Well, the first thing that turned some people off was that Jesus was always preaching about himself. In Luke chapter 4 verses 16 to 21, he said he was the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 61 verse 1, and he said that God was his father in John chapter 5 verse 17. This made him seem rather pretentious to most Israelites, who felt that he was trying to monopolize a religious system that had existed for thousands of years. Obviously, he had a reason for doing so. He had a hand in creating the world, as shown in Colossians chapter 1 verse 16, and he would be the one to eventually fix it, according to Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11. The Torah was filled with references to him, like Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 15 and Isaiah chapter 9 verses 6 to 7. However, they didn't really understand the reason he came, so they felt he was just being pompous. Another thing Jesus did was disrespect traditions and authority. In Matthew chapter 12 verse 1, he and his disciples collected corn on the Sabbath, even though such activity was prohibited in Numbers chapter 15 verse 32. He called the elders hypocrites several times, like in Matthew chapter 15 verses 7 to 9, and he repeatedly insulted them in Luke chapter 11 verses 37 to 52. He even said it was believing in God through him that would bring salvation. As it was said in John, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. John chapter 6 verse 35. He was the son of a mortal man, as the Jews noted in John chapter 6 verse 42, and yet he was saying he was the route to salvation. One statement that Christ made in John was particularly shocking to his listeners. He said that people needed to eat his flesh and drink his blood to be saved. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man, and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. John chapter 6, verse 53. Many of them considered this to be cannibalism, even though his flesh and blood were actually the truth and not his literal body. The Old Testament only mentioned cannibalism when it talked about the fall of Jewish civilization, like in Leviticus chapter 26 verse 29 and Ezekiel chapter 5 verse 10. Plus, drinking the blood of any living thing was banned in Leviticus chapter 17 verses 13 to 14, let alone the blood of a human being. It's statements like these that caused many of his disciples to leave him in John chapter 6 verse 66. Thus, just like those who ignore social rules are considered crazy for doing so, Jesus was considered insane for rejecting the religious and cultural norms of his time. As it was said in Mark, when his family heard about it, they set out to take charge of him, because people were saying he's gone mad. Mark chapter 3 verse 21, according to the Good News Bible. Some even said he was possessed by demons, according to John chapter 10 verses 19 to 20. Thirdly, Christ's statements caused so much controversy because the Jews weren't ready to accept the truth. They didn't want to accept that their lack of faith prevented many of their people from getting healed in the past, as Jesus implied in Luke chapter 4 verses 27 to 29. They didn't want to accept that all the laws they had cherished for centuries could be ignored with good intentions, as shown in Mark chapter 2 verses 27 to 28. They didn't want to accept that the leaders they looked up to could be less knowledgeable than a carpenter, according to Matthew chapter 13 verses 54 to 58. What the truth did, therefore, was expose their hidden feelings. It forced them to rethink their previous convictions, and as anyone who started a conversation about politics knows, people get riled up when their beliefs are challenged. Reflecting on his own experience, Jesus said, Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 to 35. He didn't want to divide the country, but there was no way he could preach the truth without doing so. Also, as the author of Hebrews said, "For the word of God is quick and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart." Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. The truth wasn't dividing enemies during wartime. It was dividing ideas. Finally, many people didn't accept Jesus' teachings because they were influenced by spiritual forces. Satan had turned them away from the faith. After all, he was the king of the world at the time, according to Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 to 10, and he could influence men and women to reject the truth. As Christ said, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it." John chapter 8, verse 44. If a physical father can have a big influence on his children, think about how much more influence the world's most powerful demon could have on people like the Pharisees. There was no chance they could come to the faith. Of course, one thing we have to take away from all this is Jesus' response to this controversy. He faced death threats, expulsion from communities, and many insults, but none of that changed his beliefs or altered the way he expressed them. In fact, in John chapter 18, verses 36 to 37, he gave a little sermon to the man who would sentence him, hours before he would be hanged. Therefore, if he could stick with what he believed in despite all the controversy that his ideas caused, we should be able to preserve our faith despite the opinions that others may have about our religion. It can be depressing to face anger and hate because of our faith, but we have to remember that one day, all those who trouble us now will trouble us no more. As it was said in Isaiah, "The righteous perisheth, and no man layeth it to heart, and merciful men are taken away, none considering that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. He shall enter into peace, they shall rest in their beds, each one walking in his uprightness." Isaiah chapter 57, verses 1 to 2. And that is where I'm going to stop with this Bible Q&A. Why was Jesus always courting controversy? He was always courting controversy because he was preaching about himself, disrespecting traditions and authority, teaching people who weren't ready to accept the truth, and spreading a message that the ruler of the land didn't like. Essentially, he was courting controversy because he was doing the right thing. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe.